Welcome to the Sleeping Archive, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it.
The trial of Danton and his associates began this morning, and I attended as part of my official duties, documenting proceedings, recording testimony, maintaining the careful records that have become essential to our system of justice. What I witnessed there will haunt me for whatever remains of my life. Danton, even facing death, retained the magnetic presence that had made him one of the Revolution's greatest orators. When he rose to speak in his own defense, his voice filled the courtroom with the same power that had once inspired crowds to storm the Bastille and overthrow kings. But now that voice was defending its owner against charges of treason to the very cause he had helped establish. "Citizens," he began, his words carrying across the packed courtroom, "I stand before you not as a traitor to the Revolution, but as one of its founders. My hands helped tear down the Bastille. My voice proclaimed the Republic. My blood has been shed in service to liberty." He paused, looking directly at the judges who would determine his fate. "If I am guilty of treason, then the Revolution itself is guilty of betraying its own principles." The prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, interrupted before Danton could continue. "The accused will confine himself to answering specific charges rather than delivering political speeches." "Political speeches?" Danton's voice rose with indignation. "Every word I speak is political because my entire life has been devoted to politics in service of the people. You cannot separate my defense from my principles any more than you can separate the Revolution from its founding ideals." But they could, and they did. The tribunal's rules had been modified specifically for this trial, limiting the defendant's right to call witnesses, restricting their opportunities to present evidence, accelerating the entire process to prevent Danton's oratory from swaying public opinion. Justice had been subordinated to efficiency, and efficiency served the predetermined outcome. As I recorded the proceedings, I noticed something troubling about the testimony against Danton. Witness after witness appeared to recite prepared statements rather than offering spontaneous recollections. Their words carried the mechanical quality of rehearsed performance, lacking the natural inconsistencies that characterize genuine memory. Citizen Vadier, representing the Committee of General Security, presented documents allegedly proving Danton's corruption. Bank records, receipts, correspondence with suspicious individuals, a paper trail of treachery carefully assembled over months of investigation. Yet when Danton demanded to examine the original documents, he was told they were too sensitive for public review. "How convenient," Danton observed, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "that evidence against me cannot be examined, witnesses in my favor cannot be called, and my defense must be limited to confessing crimes I did not commit. This is not justice. It is theatrical performance with a predetermined ending." His words resonated with uncomfortable truth. Our trials had indeed become theater, elaborate productions designed to legitimize decisions already made in private. The courtroom served as a stage where the condemned performed their final scenes before an audience of approved spectators. During the lunch recess, I found myself in conversation with Marie-Claire Benoit, a co-reporter who had been documenting revolutionary trials since their inception. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature revealed under extreme circumstances. "This trial feels different," she said quietly, careful to keep her voice below the level that might attract unwanted attention. "Danton is fighting back in ways that make the judges nervous. They're rushing the proceedings because they fear what he might say if given more time." She was right. Danton's defense was exposing the contradictions and arbitrary nature of our revolutionary justice. His questions about evidence, his demands for proper legal procedure, his references to his own service to the Republic, all of it highlighted the gap between our proclaimed ideals and our actual practices. "They're afraid of him," I realized aloud. "Of course they are. Danton represents everything they've had to destroy to maintain power. He's living proof that you can serve the revolution faithfully and still be condemned as a traitor. If that doesn't terrify them, it should." The afternoon session proceeded with increased urgency. Saint-Just himself took the floor to deliver the prosecution's closing argument, his pale features animated with cold passion as he denounced Danton as the most dangerous enemy of liberty, one who corrupts from within. Citizens, Saint-Just declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. Before you sits a man who would have us believe that mercy is virtue, that moderation is wisdom, that compromise is strength. These are the words of our enemies, dressed in the language of false patriotism. He paused, allowing his words to settle over the courtroom like a shroud. Danton speaks of his service to the revolution, but what is past service compared to present treachery? What are yesterday's victories compared to today's betrayals? The revolution demands constant vigilance, perpetual purity, eternal dedication. Those who cannot meet these demands become obstacles to progress, and obstacles must be removed. Danton rose once more, his massive frame commanding attention even in chains. You speak of purity, citizen Saint-Just, but I ask you this. When everyone has been purged in the name of virtue, who will remain to enjoy the liberty we claim to defend? You are creating a desert and calling it peace, a graveyard and calling it the Republic. Those were among his final words before the tribunal retired to deliberate. But in truth, there was no deliberation. The verdict had been decided before the trial began. Within an hour, the judges returned with the inevitable conclusion: death for all the accused. As I documented the sentencing, I watched Danton's reaction to his condemnation. He showed no surprise, no fear, only a profound sadness that seemed to encompass not just his own fate, but the tragedy of what the revolution had become. So be it, he said simply. But remember this, citizens. You follow in my footsteps to the scaffold. The revolution devours its children, and yours will be next. Prophetic words that would echo through the months to come. Evening found me back at my desk, processing the execution orders for Danton and his associates. Tomorrow, the blade would fall on some of the revolution's most prominent figures, men whose names had once inspired hope across Europe. Now there were simply more entries in my carefully maintained records of the condemned. But tonight, as I wrote their names for the final time, I found myself questioning not just their fate, but my own role in this machinery of death. Each stroke of my pen had contributed to their destruction. Every list I had copied, every document I had processed, every name I had recorded, all of it had led to this moment when the revolution consumed its own founding fathers. Camille Desmoulins would die tomorrow, the childhood friend of Robespierre, whose only crime had been suggesting that perhaps enough blood had been shed. Fabre d'Églantine would die, the playwright whose artistic talents had been devoted to revolutionary causes. And Danton himself would die, the voice that had proclaimed the Republic and now questioned its methods. As I completed the paperwork, I realized I was not just recording their deaths, I was collaborating in them. My efficient documentation, my careful attention to detail, my mechanical precision in processing cases, all of it made me complicit in a system that had lost its moral compass. The clock struck midnight as I finished the last execution order. Tomorrow would bring more lists, more names, more lives to process through our bureaucracy of terror. But tonight, for the first time since I had begun this work, I allowed myself to fully confront what I had become. I was no longer Geneviève Moreau, citizen of the Republic. I had become something else entirely. A functionary of fear, a clerk of death, a small but essential cog in a machine designed to destroy human lives with maximum efficiency and minimum reflection. The revolution had promised to transform society, and it had succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. It had transformed us all. The execution of Danton and his associates took place on April 5th, 1794, under a grey sky that seemed to mirror the somber mood of the city. I did not attend. My duties kept me at my desk, processing the next wave of condemnations, but the sound of the crowds gathered at the Place de la Révolution reached even our offices several streets away. Unlike the jubilant celebrations that had accompanied earlier executions, today's crowd seemed subdued, uncertain. The cheers were half-hearted, the chants mechanical. Even the most ardent supporters of the revolution seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed with Danton's death. Henri, who had ventured out during his lunch break to witness the executions, returned pale and shaken. Danton's last words, he whispered, his voice barely audible despite our secure location. He told the executioner to show his head to the people, that it was worth seeing. Such defiance, even in death, seemed to unnerve the crowd more than inspire them. Danton had faced the guillotine with the same courage he had shown in life, but his courage now served as an accusation against those who had condemned him. The weeks following Danton's execution brought an acceleration in our work that bordered on frenzy. New lists arrived daily, sometimes hourly, as if the committee feared that any pause in the machinery of terror might allow doubt to creep in. We processed cases with increasing speed and decreasing scrutiny, quantity becoming more important than careful examination of evidence. The categories of enemies expanded further. We now hunted enemies, or virtue, a classification so broad it could encompass almost anyone. A merchant who charged too much for bread, a citizen who failed to attend revolutionary festivals with sufficient enthusiasm, a neighbor who expressed nostalgia for pre-revolutionary customs, all could be classified as enemies of virtue and processed accordingly. My daily routine had become entirely mechanical. I arrived at the offices before dawn, copied names and charges until well past midnight, then returned to my small apartment for a few hours of restless sleep before beginning again. The work consumed my days and haunted my nights, leaving no time for reflection or relationships. But even in this mechanical existence, I could not entirely escape the human cost of our activities. Sometimes a name on my lists would trigger memories of a face seen in the market, a voice heard in conversation, a life that had briefly intersected with my own. These moments of recognition were becoming rarer, not because the victims were strangers, but because I was losing the capacity to see them as individuals rather than entries in a ledger. 3 weeks after Danton's death, I processed the execution order for Marie-Claire Benoit, the court reporter who had shared her observations about the trial. Her crime was spreading defeatist propaganda and undermining public confidence in revolutionary justice. The evidence consisted of testimony from colleagues who claimed she had expressed doubt about the fairness of recent proceedings. As I copied her information, I remembered our brief conversation during Danton's trial. She had spoken of feeling different about the proceedings, of noticing the judge's nervousness. Such observations, shared in what she thought was private conversation, had been reported and reinterpreted as treasonous sentiment. The speed with which she moved from court reporter to condemned prisoner illustrated the acceleration of our terror. There was no longer time for investigation, deliberation, or careful consideration of evidence. Suspicion had become synonymous with guilt, and guilt demanded immediate punishment. Her execution was scheduled for the following morning, along with 17 others whose cases I had processed that week. 17 lives reduced to paperwork, 17 human stories concluded with the stroke of my pen. But Marie-Claire's death affected me in ways I had not anticipated. Perhaps because I had spoken with her, heard her voice, seen her as more than just a name on a list. Her execution forced me to confront the reality that my work was not merely administrative, it was personal. Each name I copied represented a unique human being with hopes, fears, relationships, and dreams that would end with the fall of the guillotine. That night I found myself unable to sleep. I walked to my window and looked out over the darkened city, trying to imagine all the people lying awake in their beds, wondering if tomorrow would bring the knock on their door. How many were reviewing their recent conversations, trying to remember if they had said anything that could be misinterpreted? How many were mentally preparing for interrogation, rehearsing explanations for their actions and associations? Paris had become a city of insomniacs, kept awake by fear of their own neighbors and the certainty that anyone could be next. We had achieved a perfect equality, the equality of universal terror. The following day brought news that would reshape our work once again. Citizen Fouché, the brutal representative who had overseen the massacres in Lyon, was being recalled to Paris under suspicious circumstances. If even Fouché, whose revolutionary zeal had been demonstrated through thousands of executions, could fall under suspicion, then truly no one was safe. But the most shocking development came in early May, when rumors began circulating about tensions within the Committee of Public Safety itself. Whispered conversations in the corridors spoke of disagreements between Robespierre and other committee members, of faction forming within the highest levels of revolutionary government. Such rumors were dangerous to repeat, even more dangerous to believe, but impossible to ignore entirely. If the committee itself was divided, if the leaders of the revolution were questioning each other's loyalty, then the logical conclusion was that the terror would eventually consume even its architects. One evening in mid-May, as I worked late processing the day's execution orders, Henri approached my desk with unusual urgency. His perpetual nervousness had intensified to the point where he could barely hold papers steady, and his eyes darted constantly toward the doors as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "Citizen Moreau," he whispered, his voice so low I had to lean forward to hear him. "There are changes coming, big changes. The word from upstairs is that new directives will be issued soon, expanding our mandate even further." New directives. The phrase filled me with dread. Each expansion of our mandate had meant more names, more lists, more lives processed through our machinery of death. If we were to expand further, I wondered who would be left to govern once all the suspected enemies had been eliminated. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "They're talking about accelerating the entire process, reducing trial times, eliminating certain procedural requirements, increasing the daily quotas." He paused, glancing around nervously. "Some say they want to process 1,000 cases per day." 1,000 cases per day. The number was staggering, representing not just an increase in quantity, but a fundamental transformation in the nature of justice itself. At such speed, trials would become pure formality, evidence would be irrelevant, and individual examination of cases would be impossible. "Henri," I said carefully, "how can they possibly maintain any pretense of justice at such a pace?" His response chilled me to the bone. "Justice has become inefficient, Citizen Moreau. The revolution requires results, not procedures." That night, I sat at my desk long after completing the day's work, staring at the stacks of execution orders I had processed. Each piece of paper represented a life that would end tomorrow, a story that would be concluded, a voice that would be silenced forever. Summer arrived in Paris with unseasonable heat that seemed to mirror the fevered intensity of our revolutionary activities. The new directives Henri had warned me about were implemented in June with the passage of the law of 22 Prairial, which streamlined the process of revolutionary justice to a degree that would have been unimaginable even months earlier. Under the new law, the Revolutionary Tribunal was restructured to handle cases with maximum efficiency. Witnesses were no longer required to testify in person. Written denunciations were sufficient. Defendants were denied the right to legal counsel. The definition of enemies of the people was expanded to include virtually any form of dissent, or even insufficient enthusiasm for revolutionary policies. Most significantly, the tribunal was now authorized to impose only one of two sentences: complete acquittal or death. The moderate punishments that had previously existed, imprisonment, deportation, confiscation of property, were eliminated entirely. Justice had become binary, absolute innocence or execution. The impact on our workload was immediate and overwhelming. Within the first week of the new law, I was processing 3 times as many cases as before. The careful documentation that had once characterized our work gave way to hasty copying of basic information, names, ages, charges, the essential details required for efficient execution. But the most disturbing change was not in the quantity of cases, but in their nature. We were no longer targeting specific categories of enemies: aristocrats, counter-revolutionaries, foreign agents. Now we processed anyone who had attracted attention for any reason. a baker who complained about flour shortages, a mother who wept too openly at her son's execution, an old man who failed to remove his hat quickly enough when a revolutionary procession passed. The revolution had reached the logical conclusion of its purification process. Everyone was potentially guilty, and guilt was easier to assume than innocence to prove. One case particularly haunted me during those frantic summer weeks. Citizen Amélie Rousseau, age 16, was accused of counter-revolutionary sentiment and corruption of public morals. Her crime was writing poetry that expressed melancholy about the current state of France. The poems, discovered during a search of her family's apartment, contained lines lamenting the divisions among the French people and expressing hope for eventual reconciliation. Such sentiments, which would have been considered patriotic in any normal society, were now interpreted as coded criticism of revolutionary policies. Amélie's youth provided no protection. If anything, it made her more dangerous in the eyes of the committee. Young people, they reasoned, were more likely to influence others and spread counter-revolutionary ideas. As I copied her information, I wondered about the life that would be cut short tomorrow. 16 years old, she had been only 12 when the revolution began, a child whose entire adolescence had been shaped by the events we had set in motion. What kind of poetry might she have written in a world that valued creativity rather than conformity? What kind of woman might she have become if given the chance to mature? But such questions were luxuries I could no longer afford. There was too much work, too many names, too many lives to process through our accelerated machinery of death. The heat of that summer was unlike anything I had experienced in Paris. Day after day, the sun blazed down on our streets with an intensity that seemed to amplify the fever pitch of revolutionary activity. The air in our offices became stifling, made worse by the press of bodies and the nervous sweat of clerks working under impossible pressure. Henri's condition deteriorated further under the strain. His hands shook so violently that he could barely hold a pen, and his face had taken on a greyish pallor that spoke of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. Several times I caught him staring at the lists of names with an expression of pure horror, as if seeing clearly for the first time what we were actually doing. "How many?" he asked me one evening, as we worked past midnight on the day's execution orders. "How many have we processed since this began?" I had been keeping my own informal count, though I tried not to dwell on the numbers. Since the law of 22 prairial, nearly 2,000, no, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I mean since the beginning, since we started this work. The question hung in the air between us like an accusation. I had never calculated the total, partly from lack of time, but mostly from an unwillingness to confront the full scope of our activities. But Henri's question forced me to consider the accumulated weight of our work over months of careful documentation. "I don't know," I admitted. "Thousands, many thousands." He nodded slowly, then returned to his copying without another word. But I could see in his eyes the same realization that was beginning to dawn on me. We had become part of something monstrous, and our efficiency had only made it worse. The breaking point came in late July, when the list began to include names I recognized not just by sight, but by personal acquaintance. Madame Petit, my landlady, appeared on a morning roster, charged with harboring counter-revolutionary sentiment and failing to report suspicious activities. The evidence against her consisted of testimony from other tenants who claimed she had expressed sympathy for executed neighbors and failed to celebrate revolutionary victories with appropriate enthusiasm. As I copied her information, my hands began to shake almost as violently as Henry's. This was not a stranger whose life I was processing. This was a woman who had shown me kindness, who had shared her meager food supplies during the worst shortages, who had treated me more like a daughter than a tenant. Her crime was compassion. In our perfected republic of virtue, mercy had become indistinguishable from treason. That evening, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable even weeks earlier. Instead of going directly home, I took a circuitous route through the city, walking streets that had become as dangerous as any battlefield. I needed to see Paris with my own eyes, to understand what we had created beyond the confines of our administrative offices. He nodded slowly, then returned to his copying without another word. But I could see in his eyes the same realization that was beginning to dawn on me. We had become part of something monstrous, and our efficiency had only made it worse. The breaking point came in late July, when the list began to include names I recognized not just by sight, but by personal acquaintance. Madame Petit, my landlady, appeared on a morning roster, charged with harboring counter-revolutionary sentiment and failing to report suspicious activities. The evidence against her consisted of testimony from other tenants who claimed she had expressed sympathy for executed neighbors and failed to celebrate revolutionary victories with appropriate enthusiasm. As I copied her information, my hands began to shake almost as violently as Henry's. This was not a stranger whose life I was processing. This was a woman who had shown me kindness, who had shared her meager food supplies during the worst shortages, who had treated me more like a daughter than a tenant. Her crime was compassion. In our perfected republic of virtue, mercy had become indistinguishable from treason. That evening, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable even weeks earlier. Instead of going directly home, I took a circuitous route through the city, walking streets that had become as dangerous as any battlefield. I needed to see Paris with my own eyes, to understand what we had created beyond the confines of our administrative offices. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity what we had accomplished. We had not created a republic of virtue, we had created a republic of fear. We had not established justice, we had institutionalized vengeance. We had not liberated the French people, we had enslaved them to an ideology that demanded ever greater sacrifices. And I had been part of it all. Every name I had copied, every list I had processed, every execution order I had completed, all of it had contributed to this moment when the revolution finally revealed its true nature. As I stood by the river in the darkness, I began to understand that the revolution would not stop with its external enemies or its internal opponents or even its own founding fathers. It would continue until it had consumed everyone, including those who served it most faithfully. The logic of revolutionary purity demanded nothing less than the elimination of all impurity, and in a world where perfection was impossible, everyone eventually became impure. The revolution was not building a new society, it was preparing its own funeral pyre. And clerks like me were carefully documenting every detail of the process, maintaining perfect records of our collective suicide. Tomorrow I would return to my desk, take up my quill, and continue processing the names of the condemned, because that was what the revolution required, and the revolution had become stronger than any individual conscience. But tonight, for the first time in months, I allowed myself to remember who I had been before I became a functionary of fear. Tonight, I mourned not just for the victims whose names I had processed, but for the person I had been before the revolution taught me to see human lives as administrative problems to be solved with maximum efficiency. The river flowed past, indifferent to revolutionary justice and human suffering alike. In its steady current, I glimpsed something the revolution had tried to eliminate: the persistence of nature beyond politics, the continuation of life beyond ideology, the possibility that some things might endure even the most perfect terror. But such thoughts were dangerous luxuries. Tomorrow would bring new lists, new names, new lives to process through our machinery of virtue. The revolution continued, and so must I, one name at a time until there were no more names left to write. It is now the 27th of July, 1794, 9 Thermidor in our revolutionary calendar, and I write these final words by candlelight in my small apartment, knowing that tomorrow may bring my own name to someone else's list. The events of today have shattered the machinery of terror that consumed our nation, but they have also revealed truths about human nature that will haunt me for whatever remains of my life. This morning began like any other during these months of accelerated terror. I arrived at the committee offices before dawn to find the usual stacks of cases awaiting documentation. But there was an unusual tension in the air, whispered conversations among the clerks that ceased whenever supervisors approached, meaningful glances exchanged between colleagues who had long since stopped trusting each other. The source of this tension became clear around midday, when news reached us that Robespierre himself had been arrested by the Convention. The incorruptible, the architect of our Republic of Virtue, the man whose vision had shaped every list I had copied and every name I had processed, he was now himself accused of tyranny and conspiracy against the people's representatives. The irony was so perfect it felt like the punchline to a joke that had been building for months. The revolution had finally reached its ultimate destination. The man who had orchestrated the terror was now to be consumed by it. Henri collapsed when he heard the news, simply fell from his chair onto the floor, his body finally succumbing to months of accumulated stress and fear. As we carried him to a side room, I noticed that his hands had finally stopped shaking, not from relief, but from complete nervous exhaustion. "What does this mean?" he whispered as we helped him to a couch. "If Robespierre can fall, what happens to the rest of us?" It was a question that haunted every corridor of the committee offices. We had all been servants of Robespierre's vision, functionaries in his machinery of virtue. Did his fall make us complicit in tyranny, or did it offer salvation from the system we had helped create? The answer came quickly. By evening, Robespierre and his closest associates, Saint-Just-Cousteau and others, had been executed without trial, victims of the same summary justice they had imposed on thousands of others. The revolution had devoured its final children, completing the circle that had begun with such hope and promise 4 years earlier. But as I processed the execution orders for these men whose directives had guided my work for months, I felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice served. Instead, I felt only emptiness, the hollow realization that their deaths changed nothing fundamental about what we had done or who we had become. The machinery of terror they had created would be dismantled, but the damage was already complete. France lay exhausted, traumatized, morally bankrupted by years of systematic brutality conducted in the name of virtue. We had proven that human beings, given sufficient ideological justification, could rationalize any atrocity and commit any crime while believing themselves to be serving justice. As I write these words, I can hear celebrations in the streets outside, citizens rejoicing at the end of the terror, believing that Robespierre's death has restored freedom to France. But I know better. Freedom cannot be restored so easily because we have lost something more fundamental than political liberty. We have lost our capacity to trust each other, to live together peacefully, to believe in the possibility of justice without vengeance. The revolution taught us to see enemies everywhere, to interpret disagreement as treason, to solve political problems through elimination rather than compromise. These lessons cannot be unlearned simply because their primary teacher has been silenced. Over the past months, I have processed the execution orders for thousands of human beings. Each name I copied, each charge I recorded, each life I documented before its ending, all of it has accumulated into a weight that I will carry forever. I cannot claim ignorance of the consequences of my work, cannot pretend that I was merely following orders or serving abstract justice. I was part of a system that reduced human beings to administrative problems, that treated life and death as matters of bureaucratic efficiency, that prioritized ideological purity over basic humanity. And I performed my role with the mechanical precision that made this system possible. Marie-Claire Benoit, the court reporter who tried to maintain some connection to justice, Amélie Rousseau, the 16-year-old poet who dreamed of reconciliation, Madame Petit, my landlady who committed the crime of compassion, thousands of others whose names passed through my quill onto execution orders. They haunt me not because I killed them directly, but because I helped create the system that made their deaths inevitable. The revolution promised to perfect humanity through politics, to create a society based on reason and virtue. Instead, it revealed the dangers of believing that political solutions can address moral problems, that governmental power can transform human nature, that any ideology, no matter how noble its intentions, justifies unlimited means. We learned that virtue, when enforced by the state, becomes indistinguishable from terror. We discovered that the pursuit of perfect justice leads to perfect injustice. We found that trying to eliminate corruption through violence only creates new forms of corruption, more sophisticated and more deadly than what came before. As I prepare to sleep, perhaps for the last time in this apartment, perhaps for the last time in this life, I wonder what will become of France, what will emerge from the ashes of our revolutionary experiment. The old regime is gone forever, destroyed by forces we unleashed but could not control. But the new regime we try to create has also destroyed itself, consumed by its own internal contradictions. Perhaps that is the revolution's true legacy, not the society we built, but the illusions we shattered. We have learned that human beings cannot be perfected through politics, that freedom cannot be secured through terror, that justice cannot be achieved through vengeance. These are hard lessons purchased with tremendous suffering, but they may prove more valuable than any political system we might have constructed. The candle burns low and morning approaches with whatever changes it may bring. I have completed my final list, processed my last execution order, served my term as a clerk in the revolution's bureaucracy of death. Tomorrow I will face whatever consequences await those who serve the terror faithfully. But tonight, as I close this account, I allow myself to hope that future generations will learn from our mistakes, that they will remember the cost of pursuing political perfection through human sacrifice, that they will choose compromise over purity, mercy over justice, humanity over ideology. The revolution is ending, but its lessons will endure, and perhaps in time those lessons will prove more valuable than all the lists I copied, all the names I processed, all the lives we consumed in our desperate attempt to create heaven on earth. The river flows past our ruined city, carrying away the debris of broken dreams. But rivers also carry life, renewal, the possibility of new beginnings. In that continuity, I find whatever peace remains available to those who have seen too much of human nature revealed under extreme circumstances. The revolution taught us what we are capable of becoming when we abandon restraint in service of noble ideals. Now we must learn what we might become when we choose wisdom over virtue, humanity over perfection, life over ideology. The last list is complete. The revolution ends as it began, with hope for something better, something more human, something worthy of the price we have paid to learn these bitter truths about ourselves.
You've been listening to The Sleeping Archive. Sleep well. History will wait.